When an ID is scrutinized, there's sort of one of the possibilities is that the voters one of the possibilities is the voter is permitted to vote, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So turning to if a voter has not been turned away or a voter has not been allowed to vote and they've now been sent to the help station, what happens then?
Well, picturing the voter at the help station, then the worker at that station, faced with this voter who does not have accepted identification, again faces a couple of possible choices. So for one thing, they can describe to them and give them the option to cast a provisional ballot. They can tell them about their option to cast a ballot in this way. Or potentially, just as in the previous column, they can not tell the voter about the opportunity to cast a provisional ballot, not offer them that chance, and then the voter would again proceed back out into the world without having cast any vote. Now, assuming that they do tell the voter about provisional ballots, then we would move to this second to last column, where if a voter has a reasonable impediment to showing an identification, there's the question of whether that poll worker is going to offer them that reasonable impediment declaration, give them the chance to declare that they have a reasonable impediment. Because if a voter doesn't have qualifying identification that they can show, even if they fill out a provisional ballot, that's generally not going to be counted without that accompanying reasonable impediment declaration. So that's another piece of that process that voters would be going through with poll workers. I'm sorry, I'm unable to hear your question.
I apologize, I must have been on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Dr. White, if they are provided, if the voter is provided a reasonable impediment declaration, does that end the analysis or what happens next?
No, then we move to this last and I think very important column where there is additional discretion. And the question here is, will those poll workers help the voter understand what they're going to need to do to cast a ballot that's going to be counted? I think anybody who's ever been to the DMV, for example, can feel the difference between being handed a form with a bunch of bureaucratic language on it and being told you need to fill it out, and actually being told what needs to happen, what needs to be filled out on this form in order for it to be accepted. And so to the extent that we see poll workers potentially being more or less helpful, more or less forthcoming to voters in explaining this process and making sure that they're able to complete this paperwork, we could again see variation in whether voters are actually able to cast a ballot that will be counted.
Thank you, Dr. White. You just described on this presentation multiple decision points that a poll worker faces when confronted with a voter identification requirement. What is the effect of all those decision points on potential voters?
At every one of these decision points, there's room for the poll worker to make some choices. And there's room for those choices to make it harder or easier for voters to vote. And so at each of these points, there's room for human decision-making, whether that's biased behavior, whether it's errors, to mean that voters do or don't make it through this entire process to end up casting a valid vote.
Dr. White, do you believe this would have a disparate impact on African-American voters?
I do, both because of the possibility for African-American voters to perhaps receive less help or information at some of these stages, but also because of the possibility that Black voters might be less likely to have identification. And if that's the case, then we can picture them being much more likely to find themselves in, especially the points on the second half of this slide. They would be more likely to be having these kinds of complicated interactions with poll workers, where even a simple mistake by poll workers could mean that they got knocked off of the path to actually casting a vote that would count.
Dr. White, does the state have any measures in place to help poll workers with any of these implementation issues in question?
Yes, during the implementation of HB 589, for example, the state developed a number of polling place materials, such as a tabletop station guide.
And why don't these tabletop station guides address any of the potential bias or confusion that you've just discussed?
Well, I mean, I guess we could essentially add another column onto this slide that includes the question of whether poll workers are going to actually refer to and adhere to what's shown in those guides. As I describe at a later point in my report, there is evidence that they were not consistently adhering to, for example, the scripts provided in the guide.
Thank you, Dr. White. Ashley, we can bring this down. Dr. White, earlier you mentioned that your analysis of implementation issues at the polling place involved the review of voter statements. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What did you mean by voter statements?
I meant affidavits from voters in this case.
And did that include voter affidavits from Paul Kearney and Dan Smith?
Yes, it did.
Earlier in this trial, were you able to hear the testimony of Paul Kearney and Dan Smith?
Yes, I was.
And was their testimony consistent with what you would expect to hear from voters in a system that is susceptible to poll worker discretion?
Yes, it was.
And why? What issues did they identify?
Well, thinking about Mr. Smith's testimony yesterday afternoon, he described arriving at his polling place and presenting a temporary driver's license because he had lost his permanent one and he didn't have the replacement yet. And after some confusion at the polling place, he described eventually being allowed to cast a provisional ballot, but not being given the opportunity and the information that he needed to actually declare a reasonable impediment such that that ballot would be counted. And it ultimately was not. Similarly, this morning, I heard Mr. Kearney describe, after what sounded like an extremely long election day, arriving late in the day without his identification, having forgotten it at home. I think we've all had that wallet in the other pants moment. And at that point, he again encountered poll worker confusion, was given the opportunity to cast a provisional ballot, but described not receiving the information that he would need to make that ballot count. And so both of these things, both the problem of not being given full information and assistance about the reasonable impediment declaration, as for Mr. Smith, and not being given information about how to cure the provisional ballot from Mr. Kearney, are consistent with the kinds of discretion that I was just talking through on the slide, where poll workers can vary in whether they understand and consistently apply the requirements such that voters are able to actually navigate that process and have their votes count.
Thank you, Dr. White. You also identified provisional ballot records and reasonable impediment declarations as another source you reviewed.
That's correct.
To confirm, provisional ballot records mean the same thing as the provisional file.
Yes, I rely on the state's provisional file from the March 2016 primary when HB 589 was in effect.
And what is the provisional file?
It's a record of every provisional ballot cast in that election across the state. So it includes information about why the voter was filling out a provisional ballot, as well as some accompanying information like whether there was a reasonable impediment declaration, whether that provisional ballot ultimately got counted, and if it didn't get counted, why not?
Can you describe your analysis of the provisional file?
Yes, in my report, I focus on voters who had a particular set of experiences at the polling place. People who cast provisional ballots because they didn't have acceptable identification, but who didn't have an accompanying reasonable impediment declaration, which you would expect many of them to have if they were voting without ID. And I can then see also whether those ballots ultimately get counted, and if not, why not?
Dr. White, in your report, you stated there were limits to your analysis. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
What did you mean by that?
Well, a couple of things. The first I should make is kind of an obvious point, but the provisional ballot file can only tell you about the people who cast provisional ballots. What this means in this case is that if someone did not make it to the stage of being allowed to cast a provisional ballot, if, for example, they were turned away from their polling place without being given full information about that option, then I wouldn't see them in this analysis. This is only going to let me see a particular set of problems that arose at the polling place. And the other thing that I note in the report is that the provisional ballot file doesn't always have full information about what transpired at the polling place to let me see, exactly what happened when that voter was casting that provisional ballot. Sometimes there's additional detail provided, but when trying to figure out different stories about what could have happened that day at the polls, I don't always have full information.
And Dr. White, how many affected voters are listed in the provisional file?
Well, I see over 1,400 voters who cast a provisional ballot with the reason for that being no acceptable ID in the file, without a reasonable impediment declaration. And of those, I find that 1,096 of them were ultimately not counted, with the reason given for them not counting being no identification.
Dr. White, I would like to show you what has been marked PD5X3. Dr. White, can you see this demonstrative that says official reasons ballots not counted at the top?
Yes, I can.
Dr. White, does this slide represent reasons listed in the provisional file for why votes were not counted?
Yes, as I mentioned, I cannot always see additional detail, but I highlight some cases in my report where we do have additional information about what happened leading up to that ballot not being counted.
And what does this tell us?
Well, these particular cases indicate to me evidence of poll worker error leading up to these ballots ultimately not being counted. So, for example, if I take this voter in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, the file tells us that this person didn't have acceptable ID. The person filling out or updating the file indicates that they should have been offered a reasonable impediment form, given that their ID expired in 1995. However, the person did not have a reasonable impediment declaration accompanying their provisional ballot. And so ultimately their vote was not counted for ID reasons. And so this pattern of notes in the file indicating that poll workers had not adequately followed the procedures of the ID requirement indicates to me that they were not consistently applying the practices that had been described in, for example, some of the state's materials.
Thank you, Dr. White. Ashley, we can bring this down. Were you also able to conduct an analysis of African-American voters whose vote was not counted due to the failure to show ID?
Yes, I describe in my report that of those 1,096 voters who cast a provisional ballot for reasons of not having identification, who didn't have an accompanying reasonable impediment declaration, and who ultimately didn't have their vote counted for reasons of not having identification. Those voters that had that specific set of polling place problems, they are much more likely to be Black than the electorate as a whole during that spring primary. They are disproportionately African American, over 1/3, which is substantially higher than the spring electorate that year.
Thank you, Dr. White. You also indicated earlier that you relied on voter surveys. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What are they?
Well, I rely here on 2 years of the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, which is a survey of registered voters, representative samples from each state that is run every 2 years during just after general elections. It's funded by Pew. It asks voters about their experiences when they went to the polls, asks them about their experiences voting.
And Dr. White, why did you use voter surveys here?
Well, it gives us a sense of the kinds of experiences that voters are having at the polls, and it lets us do that for a wider and more representative sample of voters than I would otherwise have available to me. In the absence of being able to go back in time and personally monitor what was happening at polling places, this gives me some indication of the kinds of interactions that voters are having when they go to vote.
This survey include information concerning North Carolina.
Yes, I limit my analysis of the publicly available national survey data to focus only on respondents from North Carolina in both years.
Thank you, Dr. White. How are voter surveys regarded in your field?
Well, they are one of our main sources of information about people's experiences with the electoral system. This one, the SPAE, the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, is one of the main, most commonly used sources of information in the literature about voters' experiences at the polls, particularly with regards to being asked for voter identification.
And Dr. White, which survey years did you look at?
I looked at both 2014 and 2016.
And what were the results of the 2016 survey?
Well, I should back up and note that the 2016 survey was run after the 2016 general election. So this was asking voters about their experience during an election when there was not a state voter identification law in place in North Carolina. So this is a case where we should not expect that very many voters would have been asked for identification. Nevertheless, as I describe in my report, a substantial fraction of people who voted in person in North Carolina reported having shown photo identification at the polls when they went to vote. And in response to a follow-up question, a sizable share of those respondents reported that that was because they had been asked for photo identification at the polls.
And what does this tell us?
Well, it tells me that in elections where poll workers in North Carolina are given even a small amount of discretion to do things like ask for identification, they do that in ways that are, they implement that in ways that are not consistent with the law and that are just not generally what they should have been doing.
Thank you, Dr. White. Were you able to conduct an analysis of minority voters using 2016 data?
I was not. The SPAE draws a sample of 200 voters per state per year. And so there are relatively few members of any given racial group within this sample. And so I wouldn't use that to to characterize the experiences of voters by racial group.
What about the 2014 survey?
Yes, I turned to the 2014 survey because in that year, the SPAE team ran an oversample, which means that in a number of states, including North Carolina, they collected even more voter surveys than they usually would. So in this year, we have a sample of 1,000 registered voters from North Carolina who are asked about their experiences in, again, the 2014 general election.
And what were you able to conclude from your analysis of the 2014 survey?
Well, I should note that, again, this was an election in which there was not a state voter identification law in place. So again, we should not have anticipated very many voters being asked to show identification. Nevertheless, we again see similar patterns to the 2016 data of voters reporting being asked for, showing and upon further questioning, having been asked for photo identification. And these experiences are racially disparate. White voters are about 7 percentage points less likely to report that they had been that they had shown photo identification at the polls than non-white voters.
What do these surveys where there was no voter ID requirement tell us about the implementation of a voter ID requirement?
Well, they indicate to me that even in cases of a fairly minimal voter ID requirement under the Federal Help America Vote Act, that poll workers often exercise their discretion at the polling place in ways that are inconsistent with the law and in ways that are racially disparate. And so if we think about taking poll workers with that pattern of behavior and placing them into a system with an additional strict, complicated voter identification requirement that allows them to, or forces them to have a variety of interactions with voters around this identification requirement, as you and I just talked to on that slide with the various points of discretion, there's every reason to fear that these poll workers will then turn to that process in a way that could disproportionately harm African American voters.
Thank you, Dr. White. In your report, you also reference post-election decisions as another potential implementation issue. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What do you mean by post-election decisions?
Well, after the ballots have been cast, a number of things happen. County election staff do some research, and then the County Board of Elections has to do some paperwork. The canvas comes about. And so at that point, they are being asked to review things such as reasonable impediment declarations, as well as to determine whether provisional ballots will be counted or not. So these are the kinds of decisions that I have in mind in that section of the report.
Why is this another area where human biases or errors can yield disparate outcomes?
Well, this is another place where we've got many actors being asked to behave in a consistent way. In this case, we've got 100 county boards being asked to sort through these various pieces of information about what happened at the polling place and make determinations about whether these reasonable impediment declarations, for example, are valid and whether ballots will be counted. And so there's room here for these various groups of people to potentially reach different decisions in similar situations, to vary in how they interpret or apply the state's guidance. And this could mean that within a county, potentially, boards would treat otherwise similar voters differently across race, but it also could mean that across the board, we could see county to county variation in how counties make decisions about how to treat specific situations. And so given that the geography, the racial geography of North Carolina is such that voters live in different parts of the state in different shares, that could mean that county level variation within the state could lead to some groups of voters being treated differently, having different outcomes from the same types of situations, depending on what county they were in.
Thank you, Dr. White. Are you aware that the state board conducts its own audit?
Yes, I am.
Why does this not address your concerns?
Well, it relies on the state to essentially find and correct every mistake or source of variation that could be arising out of these 100 boards of elections making their decisions on a variety of different forms of paperwork. And as we saw in the rollout of HB 589, as I describe in my report, there is evidence that these counties reached different decisions in some cases that were not ultimately drawn into line with each other by the state's audit process. So I'm doubtful about the state's ability in future to catch everything that could potentially go wrong or vary at the county level.
Dr. White, I want to turn to another topic you discussed in your rebuttal report. Are you familiar with the concept of voter fraud?
Yes, I am.
Generally, when people use that term, what are they referring to?
Well, they can use it to describe a number of things like voter impersonation or double voting. But in general, I think they're describing the idea of people casting ballots that for some reason they are not eligible to cast.
Dr. White, in your understanding, how common is voter fraud?
In the modern US context, extremely rare.
And what is this view based on?
Well, it's based both on scholarly literature of academics attempting to find and catalog and study cases of voter fraud, as well as efforts by government to find and to prosecute cases of voter fraud, both of which have turned up relatively few verified cases.
Do these studies provide any other reason for the appearance of purported voter fraud?
Yes, both the academic literature and I believe former Director Strack's report notes that in many cases, what appears at first to be evidence of voter fraud, such as, for example, double voting, a person voting twice, either in the same jurisdiction or another jurisdiction, can actually be explained by clerical errors. For example, someone has the same name and birth date across two different states, or within the jurisdiction, a poll worker, sees that John Smith Jr. has voted, but checks off the box next to John Smith Sr. So often, even when we do see initial indications that look like voter fraud could have occurred, further investigation often finds that these are explicable through other more likely reasons.
In your understanding, is voter impersonation common?
No, not at all.
And do you believe that a voter, or what is your view about whether a voter identification law would prevent let me rephrase that. In your view, do you believe that voter identification laws would be able to prevent voter impersonation from occurring?
No, I don't. I mean, I guess I should start by noting that thinking about combating voter fraud kind of implies that it exists, right? That there's an amount of voter impersonation out there that we would be cutting down, when in fact it's extraordinarily rare. But furthermore, the relatively few cases we do observe of voter impersonation, as former Director Strack notes in her report, are often of people impersonating someone close to them, like a family member. And in that case, it's hard for me to imagine that they would not be able to access that person's ID in many cases to then go impersonate them.
Dr. White, are you aware that Director Strack stated that voter ID is necessary to provide confidence and evidence to voters that election officials are carrying out their duties to safeguard elections?
I am.
Do you agree with that statement?
No, I do not.
Why not?
Well, as I note in my second report in this case, we don't see evidence that voter identification laws actually bolster public confidence in elections or that they make people less concerned about voter fraud. I mean, as I note there, it's always difficult to connect the causal arrow to be sure that voter ID laws are having some particular causal effect on something like voter confidence. But in this case, we generally don't even see the correlation that we would expect to see between these two variables. So no, I don't see evidence that that's the case.
Dr. White, based on your analysis, what is the likely result of implementing a voter ID law like SB 824?
Well, my expectation is that SB 824 introduces, as I describe in my report, a series of additional points of discretion where human patterns of decision making, such as bias or errors, could lead to problems in implementation that would disproportionately disadvantage African American voters in the state.
Thank you, Dr. White. No further questions at this time.
All right, Mr. Thompson, you may cross-examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor, and good morning, Dr. White. I'm David Thompson. It's nice to meet you.
You as well.
And so do you, Dr. White, have expertise in the administration of elections?
I am not an election administrator, though, as described, I have published on the behavior of people who serve in elections offices.
Have you ever volunteered as a poll worker?
No, I have not.
Have you ever worked with a Secretary of State's office?
No, I have not.
Have you ever consulted with a Secretary of State's office?
No, I have not.
Have you ever worked with a state board of elections?
No.
Have you ever consulted with a state or local board of elections?
No.
Have you ever observed vote counting?
No, I have not.
Have you ever attended a local election board session where they were considering provisional ballots?
No, I have not.
You are generally skeptical of the value of voter ID laws, given the benefits of these laws as they're often described, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in 2016, you wrote an article in the Boston Review in which you spoke out against voter ID laws, correct?
I described the scholarly literature on voter ID laws, including my own work on the behavior of election officials when communicating with voters about voter ID laws.
And in that piece, you concluded that as a matter of policy, you thought they were bad ideas, these laws, right?
I don't remember if that's an exact quote, but I did express the belief that voter identification laws could pose substantial burdens or problems for voters, and that the purported benefits of voter identification laws in preventing fraud are not, as I said a few minutes ago, grounded in empirical reality.
And for that reason, you thought it was bad public policy to have these types of laws, right?
I saw costs without benefits.
You were retained to examine whether and how human biases could lead to racial disparities in the implementation of SB 824. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
You would agree that implementation errors are a departure from a statute's design, correct?
When you say a departure from the statute's design, how should I interpret that?
Well, let me ask you, are you aware of any evidence that SB 824 was designed with the intent to foster implementation errors?
I have conducted no analysis of the intent of anyone involved in writing or passing SB 824.
As a general matter, you would guess it's always possible that some implementation errors will occur with a given process, correct?
Yes, it's possible.
Human discretion in implementing election law can result in biased outcomes, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And by human discretion, you mean decisions that are made by humans in the process of implementing election laws at various stages, right?
Yes, that's right.
And Professor, you're not here today casting aspersions at the good faith and sincerity of North Carolina poll workers, are you?
No, I have no information on which to assess their good faith.
Okay. You credit the fact that those who administer North Carolina elections laws will try their best to comply with the law. Is that right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
You credit the fact that those who are charged with implementing North Carolina's election laws will try their best to do so faithfully, correct?
I, again, have no information on which to assess the efforts of, like the intentions of people implementing election laws.
Members of all racial groups can demonstrate implicit bias. Is that right?
Yes, that's possible.
Do you know if members of all races demonstrate implicit bias to the exact same extent as other races?
Do you have a particular context in mind? In general, I would say no.
Okay. Do you know the racial composition of the North Carolina poll worker workforce?
No, I do not.
Is it true that there's less opportunity for bias to manifest itself if two members of the same race are interacting with each other?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood your question.
Well, let's say that a white voter goes into a North Carolina poll and is greeted by a white poll worker. Is there less room and less probability that the implicit bias of the white poll worker will somehow work to the disadvantage of that voter than compared to if a Hispanic voter showed up?
I don't have information on which to assess the extent to which poll workers of varying races would display implicit bias. But to the extent that you're asking about implicit bias that would disadvantage members of a given group, most studies of implicit bias, which is, as I will note, only one part of the possible story described in my report, studies of implicit bias generally focus on differential treatment, and they generally find differential harm to racial, disadvantaged racial groups. So I guess I'm not quite sure how I should interpret your question about implicit bias leading to discrimination against a white voter. I guess I'm.
Do you know what percentage of African American voters in the state of North Carolina interact with African American poll workers?
No, I don't.
You would agree that there are a lot of laws that have to be administered in running an election, correct?
Yes, I would.
Poll workers need to ascertain whether voters are in the right precinct. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And implicit bias could, in your opinion, affect that aspect of election law administration. Is that right?
Potentially. So again, implicit bias is one possible explanation for the patterns I describe in my report, but I certainly don't lay it out as the only process that could be in play.
You're not aware of anyone that's ever been able to detect implicit bias in a measurable way with respect to determining whether people are in the right precinct, correct?
No, I'm not.
Poll workers also have to enforce prohibitions on electioneering, is that right?
Yes, in some jurisdictions.
And implicit bias could, in your opinion, affect that aspect of election law administration, right?
Theoretically.
But you're not aware of anyone who's ever been able to detect implicit bias in the administration of that type of election law, correct?
I'm not aware of anyone who has looked at that.
Poll workers have to ensure compliance with limits on voters receiving assistance in the ballot box. Is that right?
In some jurisdictions.
And implicit bias, in your opinion, could affect the administration of that election law, right?
Theoretically.
And you're not aware of anyone that's ever been able to detect implicit bias in that aspect of election law administration, correct?
Similarly, I'm not aware of anyone who has looked for implicit bias in that area of election administration.
Poll workers have to ensure compliance with a prohibition on those who lack the mental capacity to vote, like those with severe Alzheimer's, correct?
In some jurisdictions.
And implicit bias could impact the administration of that election law, right?
Theoretically.
But you're not aware of anyone who's ever been able to find measurable effects of implicit bias in connection with that aspect of the election law administration, correct?
Again, I have not seen anyone look at that.
Poll workers have to enforce hours of operation and make judgments as to when people got in line and whether they can actually vote after hours. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And poll workers could exhibit implicit bias, in your opinion, in that process. Is that right?
Again, theoretically.
But you're not aware of anyone who's ever actually been able to measure implicit bias in that aspect of election law, correct?
Again, I'm not aware of any study that has attempted to do so.
Poll workers also have to enforce the requirements of the Help America Vote Act. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And officials also have to administer the prohibition on non-citizen voting. Is that right?
Yes.
And election officials have to administer the prohibition on felon voting. Is that right?
Yes, though the last two cases may not actually get checked at the polling place. It's often handled at the stage of registration.
I'd like to publish at this time, with the court's permission, LX 246. This is a report from J. Morgan Kozer, and it comes from the joint appendix in the McCrory case. You can see the title page there. And then Ms. Hardiman, let's switch to the next page if we could. Okay, Professor, you can see this is table 2. It says the black vote rising. And you see in the left column election year. Do you see that, Professor?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and then it says percentage of citizen age voting population, white and African American. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and we can see that in 2008 and in 2012, African Americans voted in North Carolina. I'll represent to you, this is North Carolina we're looking at higher rates than white voters. Is that right?
That is what I see in this table.
And assuming this table is accurate, it would demonstrate that whatever levels of implicit bias may exist within the totality of all North Carolina election laws, that African Americans have been able to overcome that implicit bias and in fact participate at greater rates than white voters, correct?
I don't know that I would make that conclusion from this data. I mean, we have no way of knowing from this how many African American voters sought to vote. So I don't think it can really tell us how many overcame in order to be able to cast the votes reflected in this table.
But we can see that more of them, in fact, actually voted. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Now, you mention in your report that in 2014, 22% of North Carolina electorate showed a photo ID. Is that right?
Of the in-person voters responding to the SPAE in North Carolina. Yes, that's right.
And in 2014, there was no photo ID law in effect. Is that right?
Yes, there was no state photo ID law in effect.
Would it not be less arbitrary for the General Assembly to require everyone to show a photo ID than for 22% of the state who showed up in person to have to show randomly a photo ID?
Objection calls for speculation about the intent of the legislature.
Just 1 second. The objection's overruled.
May I hear the question again?
Would it not be less arbitrary for the legislature to require everyone to have to show a photo ID than to have 22% of the electorate have to show photo ID?
I guess I'm not sure quite how the legislature is anticipating that either the presence or the absence of a voter identification bill will be actually implemented on the ground.
Well, don't you think if you have a photo ID law on the ground that more than 22% are going to have to show photo ID?
Yes, I do expect that.
Yeah, so it would be less arbitrary, correct?
It could mean that more voters would be asked to show ID.
You would expect that, right?
I would.
Yeah. Isn't it true that the legislature reduced the potential for disparate impact on minority voters in SB 824 by including reasonable impediment provision, as opposed to just saying, if you don't have a photo ID, you don't get to vote?
That does remove the possibility of people, well, actually, I haven't assessed what happens fully with implementation in North Carolina in the absence of any voter ID law. Those are not elections that I've assessed as carefully as the ones I discussed in my report. So I'm not sure I actually have the full basis to compare those two scenarios.
You examined the implementation of HB 589 and found evidence of confusion and mistakes on the part of polling place workers, as well as local variation and discretionary decision-making in the application of the reasonable impediment process, correct?
Correct.
You would expect less confusion and fewer mistakes in subsequent elections as both workers and voters become more familiar with this routine and this law. Is that right?
Without knowing what practices would be in place in future to ensure that kind of familiarity, I don't think that I would speculate that that would automatically be the case.
Isn't it generally true that practice makes, at least if not perfect, better than before?
Well, I guess it depends on who we think is practicing and what kind of feedback they get during that practice. Poll workers sometimes return, sometimes don't, may or may not actually get feedback on whether they are making mistakes and how to correct them. I saw no evidence that the state did, for example, monitoring of polling places on election day that could allow them to give the kind of feedback to poll workers that would let them learn from their mistakes. So I can't say that I can predict that that would happen.
Don't you think voters would become more familiar with the regime over time if year after year they had to go and show a photo ID?
Potentially some voters.
Potentially some voters. And do you think those voters would also become more familiar with their rights over time, that there's some voters who would become more familiar with their rights over time?
Potentially.
You examined the text of SB 824 and the state's implementation plans and concluded that SB 824 is susceptible to similar pitfalls of human discretion. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And in your report, you reason that voters without ID might be incorrectly turned away due to poll worker confusion, and minority voters disproportionately are likely to lack qualifying IDs. Is that right?
Yes.
But you did not yourself analyze whether minority voters are disproportionately likely to lack qualifying IDs, correct?
That's correct,
You
as I noted in my
simply,
report.
oh, sorry. You
As,
finish your answer. I apologize.
that's correct, as I noted in my report.
You simply assumed that fact. Is that right?
Yes, as my report indicates, I was asked to assume that fact for the purposes of my report.
And if that assumption is not true, then the particular pathways of poll workers turning away voters without voter identification across the board might not propagate through to yield disproportionate harms for voters of color, correct?
Yes, the specific pathway in which, for example, poll workers misunderstood the requirement and were consistently, without any particular regard to race, turning voters away because they didn't have identification to present. That particular pathway would no longer have the same disproportionate impact on African American voters. Other parts of the process that I describe in my report, such as the possibility that Black voters who find themselves running that gauntlet of interactions with poll workers could still receive differential information, help, or guidance. But that particular pathway would be foreclosed without that fact being true.
In your report, you rely on reports and studies by various academics. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Specifically, you rely on an article by Page and Pitts. Is that right?
Yes, I do.
And that paper regarded the implementation of Indiana's voter ID laws, right?
I believe that was the case they examined, yes.
And you haven't studied how Indiana's voter ID law compares to North Carolina's, have you?
No, I have not, though the way in which I cite that paper is not to directly draw the conclusions that they reach about Indiana over to the case of North Carolina. It's to highlight the broad portions of the election process that can be susceptible to human discretion, as they describe in their discussion.
Now, that Page and Pitts article says that election workers' implicit bias could be mitigated by better training. Is that right?
I don't recall.
All right. Well, I'd like to ask the court's permission to publish LX 214. It's an article that appears in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, dated 2009. It's entitled Poll And it's authored by Anthony Page and Michael Pitts. And then we'll turn to page 43, and it says training might also be effective. Does that refresh your recollection, Dr. White, that the authors of this article that you rely on acknowledge that training can be effective?
Yes, I see that it says training might also be effective.
And you don't know the details of the training that will be conducted in North Carolina if SB 824 is allowed to be implemented, do you?
Not all of the details, no.
And you did not look to whether SB 824 and its training requirements or otherwise effectively adopted Page and Pitt's policy prescriptions for mitigating implicit bias, correct?
No, I didn't. First of all, I can't say that I would endorse some of Page and Pitts's reasoning about implicit bias, particularly. But furthermore, I don't think implicit bias is the only concern that we would have about poll worker behavior, the only mechanism that could lead to the kinds of problems I see in my report. So no.
You're aware that in advance of the March 2016 primary elections, the State Board of Elections engaged in a number of outreach efforts to educate voters about HB 589's requirements and to assist voters lacking qualifying ID, right?
Yes, I am.
And the state's educational efforts included television ads, is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And radio ads
Yes.
and online ads?
I don't recall whether there were online ads. I do recall the website that the state created.
Billboards, is that right?
Yes.
Voter guides mailed to every household in the state, is that right?
Yes.
And direct mailing to voters who identified themselves as lacking ID and to person on the voter rolls who did not have a state-issued DMV license, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Now, you think that we don't have as much data as we would ideally like to have to assess the effectiveness of these outreach efforts, is that right?
It is.
And in your report, you claim that the State Board of Election relies on decentralized efforts by county elections officers to communicate with voters in their communities, and that this decentralization could allow for discretion on the part of county boards or poll workers about how much information or help to provide to voters. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
But in fact, the State Board of Elections provided the County Board of Elections with educational materials that it had created and that it had produced, and the state directed the county boards to disseminate these materials within their counties. Is that right?
Yes, that is my understanding.
And the contact information on these educational materials was the State Board of Elections. Is that right?
I believe that on at least some educational materials, that is correct, though I don't believe that all communications voters could have received about the voter ID requirement would have directed them only to the state board.
Well, the state board required county boards to link to the state board website for photo identification information. Is that right?
I believe that's right.
And the state board required the county boards to ensure that the information on their websites was identical to the information provided on the state board's website. Is that right?
I don't believe I recall whether I saw that particular note in any of the materials I reviewed, but if that is your representation to me.
Yes. It is. The County Board of Elections efforts to educate voters at events were attended by at least one member of the state board voter outreach team to ensure consistency of information provided. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
And these centralized efforts reduced the discretion available to county boards. Is that right?
Relative to the other decentralized efforts that took place, yes, I believe so.
Okay, now I would like to publish JX 764. This is a copy of SB 824. And if we could flip to page 10 in this exhibit, that would be great. We'll get that on the screen, Professor, in just a moment. Great. And, sorry. So if we look at section 1.5A, it says the bipartisan State Board of Elections and Ethics Enforcement, State Board, shall establish an aggressive voter education program concerning the provisions contained in this legislation. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And if we look at 1.5A1, it says that the state board shall educate the public as follows: post information concerning changes contained in this legislation in a conspicuous location at each county board of elections, the state board's office, and their respective websites. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And the General Assembly also mandated that the state board shall train precinct officials at training sessions required as provided elsewhere in the law to answer questions by voters concerning the changes in this legislation. Is that right?
Yes, that is what it says.
And it required documentation describing the changes in this legislation to be disseminated by precinct officials at every election held following the effective date of this act. Is that right?
Yes.
It required coordination with each county board of elections so that at least 2 seminars are conducted in each county prior to September 1, 2019. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And we'll flip to the next page if we could. It required coordination with local and service organizations to provide for additional informational seminars at local or statewide level. Is that right?
Yes.
And it required coordination with local media outlets, county boards of commissions, and county boards of elections to disseminate information in a way that would reasonably inform the public concerning the changes in this legislation. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And it also required that every household in the state receive 4 mailers. Is that right?
I don't recall how many mailers were specified in the law.
Can you point to any other state in the union where a legislature required more mandatory education than the North Carolina General Assembly did in SB 824?
I did not conduct a comparison of all states' statutes in preparing my report, so I don't have a basis to make that precise comparison.
But it's certainly fair to say the General Assembly did not leave voter education about SB 824 wholly up to local county boards of elections. Is that right?
No, I would not assert that they left it wholly up to county boards of elections.
Now, the General Assembly mandated more education in SB 824 than in HB 589. Is that right?
I'm not sure on what basis you're making that comparison.
The text of the statutes, have you compared that?
I don't recall particular differences that would make me say this is substantially more public education.
It's certainly not less, is it?
Not to my memory.
All right. Now, in March of 2016, HB 589 was in place. Is that right for that primary?
Yes, that's correct.
And 2.3 million people voted in that primary, is right?
I believe that's about right. I may not be remembering the exact decimal.
I'll represent to you that to the nearest tenth, it's 2.3 million. And that was record turnout, is that right? For a primary in North Carolina?
I believe it was relative to absolute numbers of votes cast in previous primaries, yes.
And of the 2.3 million votes that were cast, there were approximately 2,500 provisional ballots that were cast. Is that right?
Approximately.
So
Excuse
that-
me, actually, only for the purposes of identification, there were substantially more provisional ballots cast, to be clear.
But for purposes of identification, the voter ID law, is that right?
Yes, provisional ballots cast where the reason given for the provisional ballot having been cast in the provisional file being no acceptable ID.
And that represents 99.9% of the votes cast were cast without a provisional ballot. Is that right?
I have not done the math, but if that is your representation of the ratio
Yeah.
of those.
It is. All right. Now, I'd like to publish at this time LX 17, which is the Grimmer and Yoder report that you referenced during direct testimony. You recall relying on that, Professor, is that right?
Yes, I do.
All right. And I'd like to pull up the abstract if we could. This is a report that's entitled The Durable Differential Deterrent Effects of Strict Photo Identification Laws by Justin Grimmer and Jesse Yoder, dated May 20, 2020. And if we look about halfway through the extract, it says, abstract, it says, using exact matching and a difference in difference design, we show that 3% of the voters who lack ID, for the 3% of the voters who lack ID in North Carolina, and I just want to pause there. Do you think that's a reliable estimate of the number of voters in North Carolina who lack an ID?
Under HB 589, based on a match between the state's DMV records and voter records, is my understanding. The paper does discuss the possibility of some measurement error in this list, but that is what is being used here.
Do you think it's a reasonable estimate?
Yes, I think it's a reasonable estimate.
Okay. And then if we continue, it says the law caused a 0.7% turnout decrease in the 2016 primary election relative to those with ID. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And do you think that 0.7% turnout decrease is a reasonable estimate?
Yes, I do.
All right. And then it says, after the law was suspended, this effect persisted. Those without ID were 2.6 percentage points less likely to turn out in the 2016 general election and 1.7% points less likely to turn out in the 2018 election. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So according to this study, the effect grew of the voter ID law after it was enjoined by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Is that right?
Yes, I don't think it's particularly surprising, given the possibility for voter confusion, that we would see the persistence of an effect. And I don't think it's particularly surprising that we would see different scales of effects at different types of elections, such as when moving from a lower turnout race like a primary to higher turnout general elections.
Let me ask you, it went from 0.7% to 2.6%. Is the better way to describe that it grew by almost 4 times or that it grew by 1.9%?
Well, to be clear, these are percentage points. So it would have grown by 1.9 percentage points in turnout.
Yes, right. So it would have grown by 1.9 percentage points. Is that the right way to think about these two numbers?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Now, the results in this paper are consistent with turnout actually increasing, but just at a lower rate than it otherwise would have, but for the law. Is that right?
Potentially, yes. They're making a comparison between two groups of voters, one with identification and one without identification, and making a relative comparison there within the state.
Now, Grimmer and Yoder also found that the effect of the voter ID law does not vary substantially by race. Is that right?
Well, it depends on how you are describing the effect of the voter ID law. They describe that the effect in the sense of the comparison between ID and no ID voters doesn't look like it's a substantially different size across the racial groups. But my recollection is that they conclude there is a disproportionate effect on African American voters in the state because they are less likely to have identification. And so the shares of voters in each of those two groups does differ across race in ways that yield, as they calculate in the paper, a disproportionate demobilization among Black voters.
Now, Grimmer and Yoder assert that the State Board of Elections did not inform voters via mail that the voter identification requirement was not in effect, correct?
Yes, they do.
And you repeated that in your report, is that right?
Yes, as I stated in my deposition, I wish that I had more clearly stated in my report that that the Board of Elections had not sent personalized mailers to voters to inform them of the change in the policy in the same way that it had sent them personalized mailers if they were on the no match list to tell them about the policy.
But the State Board of Elections did send a mailer to every voter in the state with a voter guide that clearly stated the law was no longer in effect. Is that right?
Yes, it did distribute a voter guide.
The Grimmer and Yoder study compares voter turnout among a pool of voters presumed not to have qualifying ID under HB 589 to voter turnout among voters presumed to possess qualifying ID. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And in performing their data analysis, the authors relied on a so-called no match list built by the state in 2015, which is a list of persons on the voter rolls who did not have state ID from the DMV. Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
The study presumed that individuals on the no match list are voters who lack qualifying identification under HB 589, correct?
Yes.
And it's possible that the no match list might introduce measurement error into the study's analysis because it might include individuals who no longer live in the state and are therefore no longer active voters.
Yes, that is possible and a possibility that is considered within the paper.
It's also possible that the no match list might introduce measurement error because it might include individuals who changed their name but possess qualifying ID, correct?
Potentially, though I have no information to speculate on how frequently that kind of name change would lead to disparities across the two databases as opposed to both being updated or not.
It's also possible that the no match list might introduce measurement error because it might include individuals who possess other qualifying forms of ID but are not recorded by the DMV, correct?
Yes, that's possible.
But you don't know the scale of that measurement error, do you?
No, I do not. I have not conducted any such analysis.
Were you aware that in the Curry state litigation that there was an attempt to get passport information for North Carolinians?
I believe I have heard that.
Do you have any idea how many people were removed from the no match list because of the passports?
No, I don't.
Would you consider individuals who actually have IDs that qualify, but are still on the no match list to be false positives?
Yes, that would be one way of characterizing that match.
And that could affect the results of the analysis, correct?
It certainly could, as discussed in the paper. I mean, I think when we think about measurement error, it's always worth thinking, and social scientists do, about the possibility for the presence of measurement error and its scale. It's also important, I think, to consider what that measurement error could potentially do to the estimates of a given paper. And so in this case, as I think through what it would mean to misclassify people, to, for example, have someone appear on the no match list as someone who doesn't have ID, when in fact they belong on the ID list of voters who have identification. That structure, that form of measurement error should, in the context of a design of the form that Grimmer and Yoder are using, if that measurement error existed and were large, it could potentially bias the effects that we would see. But the bias that we would see would be in the direction of attenuating the turnout effects that we see. It would tend to make the demobilization that they estimate in the paper look smaller than it actually was. So to the extent that they observe demobilization, I don't think that's easily explained by the form of measurement error that you've just been describing. If anything, that would bias us in the opposite direction. It would make the paper's estimates conservative estimates of the effect.
But you don't have the information necessary to measure the measurement error in this paper, correct?
No, I don't.
Training might help to change the behavior that people would demonstrate when implementing policies, correct?
Yes, potentially.
If poll workers are educated on the requirements of the law, they would be less likely to fall back on whatever bias they may have when implementing that law, correct?
I think that's certainly possible, yes.
In your report, you describe what you understand to be North Carolina's plans for training election workers, which you opine raises the possibility of local variation in how trainings are administered. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And you're aware of the efforts in 2016 that the state made to train the trainers, right?
Yes, I am.
And there was a training video made that was provided to the counties. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And there was a tabletop station guide provided to the counties. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And you believe that providing such materials is better than not producing or providing such materials and leaving county to their own devices for implementation. Is that right?
All else equal, yes.
And in your report, you review existing literature that, in your opinion, suggests that poll worker training efforts have not led to consistent and unbiased application of identification laws. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you cite in that paper you cite in your report a paper relating to an election in Boston. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And that was authored by Cobb, Greiner, and Quinn. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the Quinn is the same Quinn who testified yesterday. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And they examined an exit poll in Boston from the 2008 general elections, finding that Black and Hispanic voters were disproportionately asked to produce IDs. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And you did not see the precise training materials that were shown to the Massachusetts poll workers, right?
No, I did not.
So you don't know how they compare to the training materials that will be shown to the North Carolina poll workers, correct?
Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to interject.
I'm sorry.
Here. It's 11:45 and mentioned we're going to take another morning break at this point until 12 o'clock, and we'll come back and finish out the session today. So we will be in recess for 15 minutes. We'll come back at 12 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor.